It's not clear to me. It seems to be where push is not able to it's far away, and they really have trouble controlling.
They only really have control over certain pockets of the country.
Right.
Yeah.
We have a lot of people do research in
Yeah. My interest was
Does your sister live in that area?
no. But it's tropical.
And this part of the country is
Sí, I think so.
How are we doing?
So much perfect, everything's set up, all is
Very
fine.
good. So how are we on time? Minutes to spare.
Okay, let's hope.
So let's give people a couple of minutes to filter in, and then I can announce you in about 5 minutes or so.
Thank you, yeah. And let's hope there's a big crowd in the elevator.
You never know.
Está con ellos, sí. Él me dijo que
I think that area has been kind of stable. They said that there's not really much.
So you must know Don Howell well.
Yeah.
I saw when you went to the Focal blog.
Yeah? No? Do you know him?
Yeah, I worked in Hungary, so our paths crossed quite a bit. We've organized some summer schools together.
Oh, great. Okay. So you worked at CEU, or?
Well, my research is in Hungary. I worked only very briefly at the CEU teaching a summer school, so my associations in Hungary are not usually with the CEU.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. But I've ended up working quite a bit with some of the local youth who have been trained under Don, and that,
Oh, okay.
you know, it's the place where the leftists flock.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, definitely. It's amazing because I've done quite a few panels and conference things with Don together, and he always brings like these outstandingly bright, brilliant PhD students from Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, wherever.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah, I mean, he's,
good.
you know, it's the one program that you can really go if you want to do that type of analysis of capitalism, because, you know, because of the way things went, you know, the silencing of that particular language.
No, and there are no, actually, don't know if you know this left-east block.
Yeah, I'm like editor of that.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's really impressive, I think, and then this Romanian, this Critique Attack.
Yeah, Critique Attack actually hosts the Lefties website.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think that's a lot of things emerging there, and actually some really, really good analysis.
Yeah. It's of course becoming more and more work as lefties get more and more now.
Yeah, I mean, you have like brilliant stuff there, and it's really good edited.
Yeah.
I mean, if the focal block was ever at the level of lefties, I would be very proud.
Well, I think, you know, we struggle because, of course, the closer you get to the academic questions of presentation and peer review and so on, the more you lose of that on the ground stuff, right? So there's a tension there, you know. We do have to reject pieces that are analytically problematic, but we try to encourage people not to write in, you know, an inaccessible way, too academic way.
I've had the first experiences with that in the Focal blog now, when there was like someone recently coming and they had a paper who wanted to promote the formation of an indigenous party in a European state. And I mean, maybe for them it was like a revolutionary leftist move, but if you consider the debate on indigeneity in anthropology and how difficult it is to get rid of the term, and all the leftist anthropologists want to. Yeah, and then I thought, I'm really sorry guys, but we can't print it.
Well, especially over Ukraine, we've had some really contentious submissions that we had to.
Yeah, I can imagine.
You know, we always try to suggest certain edits to allow anybody to submit to still publish, but there have been a few people who have been very, you know, very frustrated with us and end up calling us, you know, Stalinists and all kinds of things. You know, but it's part of the game, right? If you play this game,
yeah, but it's a different word than the journal things.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So let's see. Only 32 after, let's give 2 more minutes.
Hi, nice to meet you. Yes, that's true. Yeah, now it was 2 years ago. Yeah, very nice to meet you. Yeah, yes. I think much better to get together with people after. Yeah, you're probably changing that anymore.
Yeah, I'll be here. I'd like to sort of go back to things you want to
Actually, yeah, meeting some people for
Yeah, I just.
Well, 9 a.m. isn't as bad as the time for work, but 8 a.m. now is that's right, yeah, so crazy stuff. So how long were you in the US? So you are yeah, well, let me know. Oh, thank you. I'm down.
Yeah, I don't, I'll send you my cards.
It's great. It's a great book.
What do you think?
Yeah, maybe we get started.
What do you think? Should I translate your book title into English for them?
Oh, you mean the German one? If you want to, yeah, please.
What do you think?
Yeah, it's
Better than me pronouncing the German.
well, that's good.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Mary Taylor. I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. We're very delighted to have Patrick Neveling here. He's a temporary professor at the Institute for Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Hamburg, and also a researcher at the Department of Cultural Anthropology and Sociology at the University of Utrecht, and an associate at the Historical Institute of Bern University. His current research focuses on the global spread of export processing zones and special economic zones since 1947, and on earlier comparable regimes in the Indian Ocean. He's the author of Manifestations of Globalization, Capital, State, and Work in Mauritius, 1825 to 2005, forthcoming in German, Cologne, Böhlau, and has published widely on the historical anthropology of capitalism. He's also the editor of Foucault blog, published by Bergham Books and the Journal Foucault. So, is your title still the same? Yes. So, the title of Patrick's talk is Relocating Capitalism, the Global Spread of Export Processing Zones and the Special Economic Zones since 1947. Welcome, Patrick.
Oh, thank you, Mary. Thanks very much for having me here. I'm very honored to be invited to speak at such a distinguished research center. I should, before I start, maybe say thanks to the funders, the Swiss National Science Foundation, who have it in their statutes that I always thank them when I speak about this, but also to the University of Bern and to Professor Christian Gerlach at the Historical Institute, who's been very supportive of my work. Also the Institute for European Global Studies in Basel has been very supportive, and then I need to thank many people around the world in the archives of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the World Bank, the Puerto Rico General Archives, in the Irish Archives, in Mauritius, Madagascar, Cyprus, Malta, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and a couple of other places where I've been to come up with the findings that I'm going to present here. As announced in the blurb or the short abstract for the presentation, this is a forthcoming book project that's already in the early writing stages. The working title for the book is the one you see here. I would also like to say that some of the findings that I'm going to talk about are going to be published early next year in these 3 different chapters, and I've put my email, no, I didn't put my email at the bottom still. I would be happy to share the proofs or the printed versions of the publications for those who are interested. And last but not least, let me apologize beforehand that I'm a bit jet-lagged, so if later on in the discussion I'm a bit slow in replying to your questions, or I forget what you actually asked and talk about something entirely different, then please just ask again. Yeah, I have timed this so that I would be speaking around 15 minutes, hopefully, and I've basically framed this as a historical journey from the establishment of the first EPZ towards the present, but I should say that the last 3-4 decades of the development are maybe not so prominently represented as the earlier decades since 1947, which has to do also with one of the theoretical ambitions of the presentation today, which is to propose a different periodization for neoliberalism as a social movement and as a practice of exploiting many people around the world in a different way than it was done before. On 1st of November 1950, 2 Puerto Rican males tried to shoot their way into the Provisional White House in Washington. aiming to kill President Harry S. Truman. A report to the US House of Representatives Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs identified the assassins as members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, said to be an underground resistance movement opposed to US colonialism. Reflecting the mindset of contemporary US Cold Warriors, the report described that party as, I quote, a handful of independent fanatics. Here's a picture of the report, by the way. Replete with terror, quote, and supported by the US Communist Party. Given this harsh tone, it is surprising that the report did not see any need for direct political action. Instead, the battle against communism in Puerto Rico was considered won because the US federal government had already extended Social Security to Puerto Rico and an extension of the US Employment Service Agency had been approved. Such measures, the report boldly declared, would eradicate the roots of terror since, I quote, "It is a historical fact that communism thrives where people are hungry and unemployed," quote end. The recent Washington shooting was portrayed as a desperate response because local Puerto Rican policies had served, I quote, "a deadly blow to the collectivist colossus of Moscow with Operation Bootstrap," quote end. The latter was called, I quote, "an intelligent and scientific application of a tax incentive program that had increased employment numbers and tripled the value of production and services within few years." A letter to President Truman, signed by approximately 300,000 Puerto Ricans, was presented as evidence for the success of recent US policies because these 300,000 signatures expressed their dismay on this brutal act of terror. Here's another map also from the early 1950s from the Institute for Global Affairs, which depicts the world as divided into a capitalist, a socialist sphere, and an underdeveloped sphere. And this publication also establishes the aim that these 800 million or so people in the underdeveloped nations need to be nurtured, fed, and well developed so that communism can be fought back and there would be a victory for US and others' capitalism. Places such as Puerto Rico rarely take center stage in academic studies of changes in global economic history and global capitalist accumulation. Historians of the Cold War, which was surely the defining global conjuncture for several decades of the 20th century, either focus on economic competition in the heartlands of the capitalist and communist blocs, respectively, or on the policies of the two blocs towards the Third World. Authors for the Cambridge History of the Cold War, for example, explain the victory of capitalism via the socialist bloc's failure to create a consumer culture comparative to the heartlands of the capitalist bloc. The race for prosperity between the German Democratic Republic and the Federal Republic of Germany is often identified as a global stage where competition between the two blocs was obvious and visible. That race also informs more complex analysis, such as that of Giovanni Arrighi, who considers the socialist bloc's growing debt to the capitalist bloc in the 1970s and the upheaval that the neoliberal counter-revolutions by Thatcher and Reagan and others caused in the global economy as defining moments of the Cold War. The following shows, as convincingly as possible, that there is a blind spot in these works. This blind spot emerges from a coupling operation. The two singles that the operation makes a couple here, are for once the historical analysis of the capitalist economic development policies in the Cold War, and secondly, what is said to have been a radical turn in patterns of global capitalist accumulation in the 1970s. As I argue in a forthcoming chapter on flexible accumulation and colonial and post-colonial transactional orders, talk of a radical turn in global capitalist accumulation encounters severe empirical restraints, once it is applied to a non-Western industrially advanced setting, to a non-Western industrially less advanced setting, such as Mauritius for the 1970s, for example. It is undisputed, of course, that a series of crises struck Western advanced capitalist societies in the 1970s. The number of workers in the industrial manufacturing declined, and so it seemed as if the whole world was changing in the 1970s. Sociologist Daniel Bell's The Coming of Post-Industrial Society provided a catchphrase for such sentiments. Not least in the social sciences, those years would cast a long shadow, however. To this day, the early 1970s have been regarded as a turning point towards post-Fordism, flexible accumulation, neoliberalism, and so forth. June Nash, in a 1995 publication, pointed to the spatial and, hence, analytical limitations to the notions of post-industrial society, as this did not take into account that changes in Western core areas had to do with the relocation of industrial manufacturing to other regions. Of course, EPZs are a crucial example here already in the 1970s. If you think about Fröbel, Heinrichs and Krey's famous publication, The New International Division of Labor, I will possibly talk about that a bit more in the conclusion to this presentation. Therefore, analytical engagement with capitalism at the scale of the global, the regional, or the factory has to consider that there are both spatial and temporal limitations to change. Caution is advised whenever the coming of a new era is declared, be this post-industrial, post-Fordist, or neoliberal. Such caution should not lead us to negate possibilities and realities of change, of course. Change, if the word is not uttered by a US president, may be a really good thing. It may produce a new, better reality for all of humankind. From a Marxian perspective, change is important for understanding history as the history of social movements. The following sketches such a history, albeit for a kind of movement bringing about historical force that is anti-social, creating wealth for some and misery for many. In order to finish my presentation on time and have the chance to benefit from a discussion, my main focus is on the establishment of the world's first export processing zone in Puerto Rico. I then used the findings from Puerto Rico to map the early decades of the global spread of export processing zones and special economic zones, and to delve a bit deeper into how this relates to US and other industrially advanced countries' foreign policies during the Cold War. And ultimately, I come back to the issue of periodizing neoliberalism. The Puerto Rican tax incentive scheme, identified above as the deadly blow to the communist collectivist colossus of Moscow, was transmitted globally under labels such as export processing zone, free trade zone, foreign trade zone, or more recently, special economic zone. For most of the period under consideration in this chapter, the standard label used for such zones was export processing zone, EPZ, and this is one of the many acronyms that I'm going to be throwing at you by the second in the next minutes. Today, these zones are the predominant locations for light industrial manufacturing, with around 70 million workers in 3,500 EPZs in more than 130 countries counted in 2007. So if you would look at your iPhones, Garments, MacBooks or Dell laptops, you would, in one way or the other, if you do a commodity chain analysis or an analysis of global production chains, be able to find out that you can trace these to a number of EPZs and SEZs around the world. Puerto Rico, turning back to Puerto Rico now, Puerto Rico came under the control of the United States in 1898, and US business interests soon turned the island into a classical monocultural economy driven by sugar. Exports to the mainland quickly rose, and US trusts earned the lion's share of profits. Once the global recession hit Puerto Rico in the 1930s, wages in the agricultural sector were largely insufficient to buy adequately nutritious food. Although the Puerto Rican needlework industry grew rapidly to incorporate 60,000 mainly women workers by the end of the 1920s, the rise of this single export-oriented manufacturing industry was insufficient in light of the fact that from 1899 to 1930 the population of Puerto Rico grew from just under 1 million inhabitants to over 1.5 million, reaching 2.3 million in 1957. Finding ways to feed and employ the rapidly increasing population was the first in the series of crucial lessons that US policymakers learned in Puerto Rico. And these would find their way into Cold War policies towards Third World development. Before 1930, Puerto Rico already foreshadowed what would later be known as the Malthusian trap or Neo-Malthusian trap of increasing birth rates, ensuing population increase, a lack of available wage labor, and ultimately gloomy prospects for a growing and increasingly young population. The political motivation to develop Puerto Rico also had to do with the growing number of Puerto Rican migrants in the US who publicly displayed anti-colonial sentiments during the 1920s. A new generation of more moderate US-leaning Puerto Rican politicians therefore became an important ally to the US government, and the Roosevelt administration extended New Deal policies to the island in the 1930s. From 1941, the Puerto Rican Partido Popular Democrático, PPD, led by Luis Muñoz Marin, also gained control over excise taxes on imports for Puerto Rican liquor, sugar, cigars to the mainland, which the federal government used as annual funding for local development projects. With this money, the PPD established a planning board, a government bank, and an industrial development company. The Puerto Rico Industrial Development Company, PRITCO, from now on became operational in 1942 and built factories to produce otherwise expensive import commodities, offering an early version of the widespread import substitution policies of post-colonial nations since the 1950s. So this is another important forerunner model in Puerto Rico for global development policies. Of course, not necessarily the one that US capitalism was very interested in after the Second World War. We have other import substitution policy ideas emerging in India in the late 1900s already, but this is for a different paper. However, the New Deal had powerful opponents on the mainland and in Puerto Rico. After the war, these opponents became very and things that we would now call a neoliberal discourse, neoliberal policies that are usually dated for the 1970s, emerged in Puerto Rico after the Second World War. As a brief side remark, this is in line with a number of recent historical works, for example, by Kim Phillips Fine, in the Businessman Against the New Deal book, or The Road from Mont Pelerin. Philip Mirowski and Dieter Plewe, an edited volume, also indicate the history of the Mont Pelerin as a society since the late 1940s. But these are, in my view, discourse analysis, whereas what I'm doing here is a history of the practice of neoliberal manufacturing and neoliberal global exchange relations. Business circles and various political parties in Puerto Rico criticized the amount of money spent per job created as a sign of failure during the New Deal policies. Strike action in government-owned factories and consultancy reports highlighting better growth prospects from private sector investment provided a pretext for the leadership of the Partido Popular Democrático and the Development Corporation to change development policies radically. In the words of the Wall Street Journal, a Puerto Rican lure, that was like a first-page headline in 1946 in the Wall Street Journal, was established. This lure was the tax incentive program, which featured boldly in the report on the assassination attempt summarized in the introduction to this presentation. It laid the foundations for the modern-day export processing zone, special economic zone development regime. PRITCO now offered mainland investors customs-free and tax-free production for 10 years alongside other government subsidies such as cheap leases for industrial plots, low rents for state-owned factories, and of course a cheap docile labor force which was policed with a heavy hand. Arthur D. Little Incorporated, a Boston-based consulting company, was hired to promote relocations. A newly founded Office of Information for Puerto Rico in Washington embarked on a vibrant promotion campaign, convincing US manufacturers, bankers, business writers, and so on of, I quote, Puerto Rico's potential as a site for textile, apparel, and other industries. PRITCO also reversed its spending policy. Now the local state invested federal money coming from the excise tax fund to provide fixed capital assets for private investors. So the spatio-temporal fix of capital here is in some ways reversed because the state takes on pioneering investments in industrial manufacturing. An example was the $7 million construction of a $7 million worth construction of a luxury hotel for the Hilton Hotels Corporation. Also, by the way, the first Hilton hotel outside US mainland. PRITCO shouldered all construction expenses. In return, the Hilton Hotels Corporation signed a 20-year lease for the building, during which the corporation had to provide working capital for the efficient and uninterrupted operations. This is mainly now based on the Hilton Hotels annual report and correspondence with PRITCO. Annual payment was 2/3 of gross operating profits, plus a sum no higher than 5% of the cost for installed furniture and fixtures. In other words, had the hotel not made any profit, PRITCO would have recuperated no more than the expenses for furniture and fixtures at the end of the 20-year lease. Evidently, the turn away from development driven by state-owned corporations and factories was radical and risky, and rightly so. Gemma Bell, for example, has identified the Puerto Rican project as the first large-scale privatization of state-owned enterprises in 20th century history. Another $4.7 million of PRITCO money went into the construction of a textile plant in Ponce, a larger city on the southern coast. The factory brought a very particular, ruthless form of US capitalism to Puerto Rico and made the island an important asset for the growing mainland coalition of businessmen opposing the New Deal. Relocations of production sites on a global scale would become the hallmark of export processing zones across the globe in the 1960s and after. As with the planning infrastructure, Puerto Rico was exemplary for the relations between state capital and labor that nurtured the emergence of such runaway shops. And now I give an example of this. The lease for the Ponce textile factory went to Royal W. Little. Little was the first mainland investor under the new tax incentive scheme, and, coincidentally, he was the nephew of Arthur D. Little, the owner of the consulting company working for PRITCO. During wartime production in the 1940s, Little, now Royal W. Little, not Arthur D. Little, set up the first vertically integrated company in the textile business in the US, Textron Inc., producing synthetic fiber-based textiles. Textron expanded rapidly and bought several spinning mills and other plants in New England, such as Lonsdale and the Nashua Manufacturing Company, whose operations dated back to the early 19th century. After the war, Little shut down most of his New England plants, firing some 10,000 workers. Did not go down well with the Textile Workers Union of America or certain local senators in the late 1940s. A US Senate subcommittee hearing in 1948 investigated the relations between the closures and Textron's recent establishment in Ponce. At the opening of the hearing, and that's a big Senate hearing, I don't know if anyone here has ever read such a Senate hearing document. It's really a bit like a Shakespearean drama, you know, like these actors show up, the businessmen, they have their consultants with them and their lawyers, and so quite interesting document. I could talk a lot more, but then we will be here till later tonight. At the opening of the hearing, the presiding senator, who by chance later died under mysterious circumstances in 1953 in a car accident, confronted Little with a letter from the Textile Workers Union of America, which stated that the, I quote, management's judgment cannot always be in the workers' interests. But we do not believe management should be free to wreck an entire community to further its own narrow objectives. Quote end. Little responded bluntly that per man productivity in New England prevented Textron from competing with other companies. And that's how the hearing more or less went. He later then also made like a symbolic gesture, saving 1,000 of the 10,000 jobs in spinning mill called Indian Hat Mills, which is also a bit like the recent day labor capital contracts, you know, like you accept the firing of many workers to save a few and so on. Let me briefly summarize and analyze the above. With the radical change in development policies, Puerto Rican leaders attempted to raise the living standard of the population by attracting mainland investors. But only substantial incentives could persuade mainland capital to move to the island. On the other side of the relocation chain, initiated by Puerto Rican EPZ policies, companies like Textron were happy to accept the compensation offered. However, this required them to shut down operations on the mainland since, they argued, production in Puerto Rico was more profitable, and obviously it was. This narrative of entangled histories of exploitation, and I mean nowadays lots of people speak of entangled histories, but we should really look carefully what is entangled and what is not entangled, provides the background for EPZs in the Cold War and in the era of decolonization. Such zones facilitated relocation of industrial manufacturing from one region to another. Relocations served to limit the bargaining power of workers in the abandoned locations of the capitalist bloc, while providing a tool to fend off socialist and communist political tendencies in the receiving Third World regions. In the 1950s, the Puerto Rican EPZ regime became a hotspot for global diffusion. US propaganda focused on high growth rates in Puerto Rico to convey a twofold message. The first was that export-oriented capitalist development could indeed produce rapid growth and therefore deliver on the promise of the good life. As Cold War tensions increased, such a message became essential to the survival of the many anti-communist regimes that the US maintained or sought to set up across the developing world. As the following section that now turns to the global spread of EPZs from Puerto Rico will show, many of these regimes, including Egypt and Taiwan, then the Republic of China, set up their own EPZs. The second message concerned the US itself. Promoting the superpower as a benevolent nation that treated obedient dependencies such as Puerto Rico with utmost care was crucial in the global climate of decolonization and the Cold War. As the island, Puerto Rico attracted increasing relocations from the US mainland in textiles, garments, switchboard assembly and other electronics manufacturing. Puerto Rican officials were sent around Latin America to give testimony of US benevolence. As early as October 1951, Puerto Rican Senator Ernesto Juan Frias toured Latin American capitals, praising US benevolence to the delight of local ambassadors. There was also a lot of propaganda brochures printed. Here's one example. There was also a company called Hamilton Wright hired to produce feature-length documentaries. Puerto Rico, Island of Progress. I think also you maybe know the Rum Diaries by Hunter S. Thompson. He was, Hamilton Wright also paid US journalists to stay in Puerto Rico and write nice things about the island. And I think Hunter S. Thompson just got on such a ticket and spent the money getting drunk in San Juan Old Town for quite a while. I actually also saw some of the correspondence, which I assume was about him between Hamilton Wright and the Puerto Rico Industrial Development Corporation. It was quite funny. Anyway, promotion activities also targeted audiences with significant leverage in regional development policy. In February 1952, the Caribbean Commission held its annual Industrial Development Conference in Puerto Rico, and the recommendations they came up with suggested export-oriented development based on the Puerto Rican organizational model as the key for industrialization across the region. For Arthur D. Little, the Puerto Rican success was excellent business. In 1950, ADL became the sole auditor for investors approaching the local government development bank for a loan. On holiday in Jamaica, one senior ADL member followed up contacts with the local government and secured a contract for ADL to advise on establishing Jamaica's first national development agency. ADL held board membership and line managed staff in Jamaican investment promotion offices in New York and London. Among other EPZ measures, an ADL memorandum suggested 10-year tax exemptions for investors as a central feature for Jamaican development policies. Business opportunities soon stretched to other countries and continents, as ADL was put in charge of the industrialization branch within the Point 4 office in Egypt. In 1960, ADL joined forces with the Asia Foundation to work on industrial development projects in East Pakistan. Of course, not all ADL projects endured successfully. In 1960, the Wall Street Journal printed a feature-length piece, and the influential German weekly Die Zeit devoted 3 pages to ADL's delivery of ideas on demand. Both newspapers emphasized one potential pitfall of Cold War development policies that neither Point 4 nor later US development projects could surmount. As the Wall Street Journal only half-jokingly mentioned, regime change in Honduras, Cuba, and Egypt has forced IDL to abandon projects that incoming socialist-leaning governments could then use for their own purposes. However, for ADL, such developments were no less lucrative. During the 1960s, the frontier of capitalist industrial manufacturing actually expanded. In the early part of the decade, the Kennedy administration set up the Alliance for Progress, and many Puerto Rican politicians and bureaucrats became US envoys to Latin America. Former PRITCO director Theodore Moscoso, for example, had an exceptional career. He was appointed US ambassador to Venezuela before moving on to an appointment as US coordinator of the Alliance for Progress in 1962. Once the Alliance for Progress turned sour, an ADL stockholders meeting on 26 March 1965 elected him to the board of directors of Arthur D. Little Incorporated. This may well have been a reward for ADL's highly beneficial relationship with PRITCO, which Moscoso oversaw for many years. ADL's Puerto Rican business had further increased in 1956 after... This is really... It's really like... They didn't want to, okay. Okay, then I'll continue, but it's really, it's really like they're talking in my ear. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'll do my best I'll speak like this, all right? Because on this side it's really quiet. Okay. No, I mean, they will calm down at one point. Yeah, I'll try again. Oh, wow, that's okay. Yeah, I'll donate some garments as well. Thank you so much. Thank you.
That helps.
Yeah, it's actually a lot better. Yeah. Okay, so Moscoso got this reward for overseeing this kind of profit for ADL. ADL's Puerto Rican businesses had further increased in 1956 after Moscoso had set a new target during Pritco's celebration of the 400th factory opening. So 1947 starting, 9 years later 400 factories already. Of course there's no word in the files how many of the 400 factories have closed down meanwhile, but maybe that's not so important for Pritco. Soon the aim was to double the number of factories from 500 to 1,000. To help with this, ADL was contracted to set up a permanent office in San Juan in 1957, and this is the moment when a very important actor enters the stage in our journey through the global EPZ world. When that new office was closed in 1962, its director, Richard Bolin, moved to Mexico to set up a new ADL resident office, now planning the establishment of bonded factories for border cities with standard EPZ incentives such as tax and customs exemptions, state-funded industrial estates, oppressive anti-union policies, and so forth. This was implemented under the Mexican government's border industrialization program, which became operational on 1st of January 1965, just one day after the forced return migration of millions of Mexicans working since 1942 in the US agricultural industry under the Bracero program. Similar to Textron's relocation to the US South and then Puerto Rico, US industrial relocations to Mexico soon met strong criticism from unions. As the capitalist bloc underwent stagflation during the 1970s, a US Congress hearing considered whether two clauses in the US tariff system, which promoted the partial manufacturing and assembly of textiles and garments and electronics abroad, were actually detrimental to the national economy. Of course, the conclusion was no. Bolin, the former ADL worker, had set up the Flagstaff Institute in the early 1970s, offering research and consultancy to US companies seeking to relocate to northern Mexico. At that hearing in 1976, Bolin helped US industrialists successfully to defend their interests against the unions. I now turn to the global spread, and here you have an outdated map from the 4th or 6th editions of Peter Dickens' book Global Shift, but I think, imagine now you would have 3,500 dots here, would be a lot more crowded, the world map, but still, if you look at the regional spread of the zones, you would still have this kind of tropical and subtropical belt very prominent even today, although already the zone in Ireland established in the late 1950s is missing on this map, and there's a couple of other zones missing actually also, but still. The US Congress hearing of 1967 sheds light on the global impact of EPZ production in the 1970s, which had also had to do with countering the policies of the non-aligned movement. Following the Bandung Conference in 1955, a number of developing nations formed what came to be called the non-aligned movement. This movement would become a powerful alternative to the capitalist and socialist blocs' policies during the 1960s and 1970s. One of its main achievements was the establishment of new United Nations agencies for the promotion of Third World development in the 1960s. This was the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. But the policies promoted by the non-aligned movement conflicted with the EPZ regime that had spread across the decolonizing world since the late 1940s. The following thus describes a historical irony, that is, that soon after its foundation, the UNIDO, this one of the two organizations established because of the pressure of the non-aligned movement, an organization intended to strengthen national sovereignty in an era of export-oriented development policies, became the driving force in global EPZ promotion delivering the triumph of EPZs in global light industrial manufacturing from the 1970s onwards, and strengthened multinational corporations instead of supporting the non-aligned movement's aim. Setting up UNIDO meant that the policies of all UN member states towards industrial developments were considered part of the new agency's agenda. This posed a decisive obstacle to the non-aligned movement's wishes to establish a new international economic order. Instead, in the 1970s, what sociologists like Fröbel, Heinrichs and Kreie labeled a new international division of labor emerged, in which EPZs brought increasingly exploitative labor relations or super exploitative labor relations to developing countries, while relocations triggered structural unemployment in the capitalist bloc. Although, of course, we have seen that the pattern of this structural unemployment in capitalist advanced regions and exploitation in developing regions already was established in the late 40s in Puerto Rico. In the mid-1960s, UNIDO's organizational structure and tasks were developed on the background of global surveys of ongoing industrialization policies across the world. By then, several countries and colonial dependencies had EPZs up and running. Others, such as the Philippines, were developing EPZs with funding from USAID and other sources. Therefore, EPZs figured prominently in the survey recommendations, and a group for export promotion was set up within UNIDO. This group quickly went to work. Headed by William Tanaka, a Japanese whose country had a lot of stakes in EPZs at the time, the export promotion group in UNIDO conducted a global survey on EPZ activities in 1970 and used the correspondence for this survey to promote UNIDO's export promotion services to national development agencies and ministries across the world. This correspondence underlines that the export promotion team had a substantial sum of money at their disposal, which had been donated specifically for the purpose of promoting EPZs by capitalist bloc nations under an instrument called Special Industrial Services. Their challenge was to spend it, and they badly needed expertise on EPZs. Similar to PRETCO in Puerto Rico, existing EPZs across the world were run by agencies that enjoyed significant independence from government ministries. And similar to Moscoso, such agencies' personnel were well trained to spot lucrative opportunities. The Kaohsiung Export Processing Zone Authority in Taiwan was the first agency to recognize that with UNIDO's export promotion, consultancy could make a fortune. Much like Puerto Rico, Jamaica and Mauritius, Taiwan's economy had long been reliant on agriculture, particularly sugar. As one of the main allies of the US since the onset of the Cold War, Taiwan received substantial US development funding, and with this, US approaches to economic development spread across the island. First plans for an EPZ had been drawn up in the mid-1950s and were realized when the first EPZ opened in 1965 as part of a new container harbor in Kaohsiung. Kaohsiung's EPZ authorities' response to the 1970s global EPZ survey from UNIDO strongly impressed Tanaka. Plans for a close collaboration between UNIDO's export promotion group and Kaohsiung EPZ were drawn up, but broke down when Taiwan left the United Nations in 1971 because they protested against a possible entry by the People's Republic of China. This was a stroke of luck for the Shannon Free Airport Development Corporation in Ireland, a partly state-owned development agency running an EPZ attached to Shannon Airport. SWATCO, another acronym, leadership not only secured the hosting of this workshop that had been planned in Taiwan in early 1972, it also placed an affiliate, Peter Ryan, in UNIDO's export promotion group as Tanaka's successor. From 1972 until well into the 1990s, a significant percentage of UNIDO's EPZ consultancy contracts went to SWATCO. One beneficiary was Shannon entrepreneur Tom Kelleher, who wrote the first handbook on EPZs on export processing zones, published by UNIDO in 1976. Here's an excerpt from the CV of Tom Kelleher that Peter Ryan consulted in order to decide whether he was fit enough to write the handbook or not. The handbook is possibly the most emblematic of the inexorable spread of EPZs from the early 1970s onwards. It remains UNIDO's second best-selling publication ever, and one of the main tasks of UNIDO was to sell publications. And many national EPZ laws strikingly resemble the suggestions made by a blueprint law for national EPZ acts that was printed at the back of the handbook. The spread of EPZs in the 1970s also shows the limits of the non-aligned movement's political aims, which demanded sovereignty over natural resources, the right to nationalize economic activities in accordance with its laws, and strict guidelines for multinational corporations operating in foreign countries. Such measures, if applied, would have contradicted most of what EPZs were about. For example, they would have restricted the free hand given to multinational corporations. But in 1975, 27 of the 77 non-aligned nations in the United Nations had EPZs operational or in advanced planning stage. If third world nations wanted to find an entry point into the world market for industrial manufacturing, they increasingly had little choice but to follow the policies established in Puerto Rico in 1947. With the third world debt crisis emerging in the late 1970s and escalating in the 1980s, this situation became aggravated and the choices of third world nations were further depleted. The export promotion team within UNIDO could not foresee those events and thus took measures to make the EPZ business independent. At a working group meeting in Barranquilla, Colombia in 1974, Peter Ryan, head of the UNIDO group, proposed an independent umbrella organization of EPZs worldwide. This World Export Processing Zones Association was inaugurated at a UNIDO-funded expert working group meeting in Bataan, EPZ, in a former US air base turned EPZ in late 1978 by delegation from 32 EPZs. 3 years later, former ADL staff member Richard Bolin, this guy here, was elected president, and the World Export Processing Zone Association's operations merged with the operations of Bolin's Flagstaff Institute. WebSAR consultants started taking a large cut of UNIDO and World Bank consultancy contracts. As this business grew, there was no real competition between Shannon and WebSAR, but they got along really well. In the 1980s, the World Bank made the establishment of EPZs a condition for many of the structural adjustment programs that indebted third world nations had to sign up to. In this, the bank could rely on the pioneering work started in Puerto Rico in the late 1940s, spread by Point 4 and the Alliance for Progress, and brought to perfection by UNIDO's export promotion group in the 1970s. Following harsh measures introduced by the World Bank structural adjustment programs, the number of operational EPZs rose from 79 in 1975 to 197 in 1986 and further to 845 in 1997. The number of workers in EPZs worldwide also grew exponentially in that period, from 700,000 in 1975 to approximately 2 million workers in 1986 to 22.5 million in 1997. Many nations established EPZs in that period, and EPZ employment rose rapidly, even in nations with socialist-leaning governments, which often had little choice but to sign up to the World Bank structural adjustment programs. An excellent example for this is Mauritius, where an EPZ was set up by the pro-Western Mauritius Labour Party in 1970. Exploitation in the zone fueled anti-imperialist sentiments that triggered 2 general strikes on the island and helped the socialist Mouvement Militant Mauricien to a landslide election victory in 1982. By then, however, Mauritius had been tied to structural adjustment programs measures for 3 years already, and the incoming government soon realized that the actual sovereign was the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And I could add here that in my PhD I calculated the national debt of Mauritius that contributed to the default, and around 28% were debts that the World Bank had provided for actually building up industrial zones. That would then be EPZs. Still, much of that exponential growth of the employment happened because the People's Republic of China, which did not have to shoulder a structural adjustment program, reversed its development policy radically in the late 1970s and early 1980s. A visit by Jiang Zemin to Shannon EPZ under this UNIDO fellowship program obviously influenced these reforms, which included the opening of 4 SEZs in China in 1980. Jiang was then senior vice minister in charge of the State Import and Export Administration, and many years later he told the Irish ambassador to China, and I have a letter of this, how important his stay in Shannon had been for policy measures introduced in the 1980s. Jiang's statement was to some extent a polite misrepresentation, since plans for the PRC zones had been drawn up in 1977, and the first foreign companies set up shop in Shenzhen, as he said, in 1979. However, you have Shenzhen running actually into serious financial difficulties in 1982, and you have a reversal of EPZ policies after that, that then, in my view, I can only base this on files held in the Hong Kong archives because I don't read Chinese, but the British had a very good eye on what was happening in Shenzhen, and I trust their judgment on that. However, the measures introduced throughout the 1980s resembled the Irish zones, involving the absence of corporate tax waivers in favor of a flat corporation tax of 15%, which had been introduced in Ireland in 1973 because Ireland entered the European Economic Community and couldn't have an EPZ with a special tax regime, so they just put the national corporation tax to 12.5% back then. And in China, also administrative control of local EPZ authorities extended beyond the industrial areas to worker settlements, which is also what happened in Shannon, where Shannon Free Airport Development Corporation owns the town, or the housing in the town. The operation of UNIDO's export promotion in the 1970s importantly tied many developing nations to local and multinational capital and made labor increasingly dependent on post-colonial patterns of exploitation. The triumph of the EPZ model in global light manufacturing industries, which means that all the technology in this room more or less will come from EPZs today, and export-oriented development agendas was finally sealed with the opening of EPZs in the People's Republic of China, which was then also replicated actually already in the 1980s by the German Democratic Republic, by the Soviet Union. Hungary bought in Arthur D. Little services in 1983. We have also a turning point, in my view, in the historical periodization of the Cold War already in the late 1970s, early 1980s, where we could possibly, in economic terms, say that the socialist bloc countries actually joined the developing countries or the underdeveloped countries in terms of labor policies increasingly. Think of the fact that this IKEA kitchen light that might be hanging in your kitchen is designed 1984 in Halle in East Germany. There was also recently a big scandal on IKEA forced labor in GDR, also in Halle and other manufacturing industries. The GDR also the first personal computers that I had as a child in West Germany by a company called Commodore, or even there was the People's Computer in West Germany, which wasn't available in the GDR, but it was 100% assembled in the GDR. Yeah, that as a couple of further anecdotes that could have extended this talk till tomorrow, 8 p.m. or further. I think there's a lot of really rich material. Also, it would be very interesting to look at the Colón zone in Panama, established in 1948. Egypt is important here. Funny stories is that the US actually helped South Vietnam to submit a proposal to establish an EPZ in Saigon 3 weeks before Saigon fell in 1975, and all these US Americans jumped on this helicopter. 3 weeks before, they still thought they could set up an EPZ. I think it's also to be considered that in Sri Lanka, if you look at the EPZ set up in the 1980s, you have like, they are these kind of the German medieval empire had these kind of peasant fortresses in Eastern Europe, and these EPZs seem a bit like that. So that would, for example, then support James Ferguson's finding on the anti-politics machine, although I think maybe we need to cross out the anti here and make it a politics and so on machine, but still. And in general terms, for the periodization of neoliberalism, I think obviously, if we look at this chart, we have a turning point in the 1970s. That's totally undisputed. But what I would like to underline is that if we look at the history of capitalism as a history of social or anti-social movements, then we have a model in place in the 1970s. In around 1970, this global UNIDO survey establishes the term EPZ, export processing zone, as a standard global term, and so forth. So we have, when the global neoliberal turn is set to kick in, it's actually already there. It's a competing regime of exploitation that has been operational in many areas of the world already. Another thing that I think is very important is to not really, I mean, of course, a lot of surplus and profit is generated in EPZs, and a company like Apple or Foxconn or so on wouldn't have such high shareholder outputs as they have nowadays. But still, that doesn't mean that this is like a rational act. Textron, for example, they closed their operation in Puerto Rico in 1957, more or less 9 years and 364 days after opening them, because after 10 years they would have had to pay taxes. And then the subsidiary that they let survive in New Hampshire, in New England, this Indian head mills, this gesture of keeping 1,000 jobs, they closed down and went to Puerto Rico, and 2-3 days after they reopened the factory. And they got another big set of PRITCO subsidies to keep the business running there. So we have a lot of, I mean, if we look at this Brodelian idea of capitalism as an anti-market, yeah, which is a layer of a strata of persona that have access to particularly high surplus generating activities. And the dispute in capitalism is over who has access, who is part of this big party on the top. And we can also look at certain fights within EPZs in Mauritius, for example, where local capital that had control over banking then ripped off like medium-sized British investors, and kind of when they needed a lot of credit drained them out, and then the Mauritian cousin got another textile factory on top of the sugar mill or so forth. So there's a lot of other medium or middle range insights to be learned from this story. But the main point that I wanted to make today, and I think that's why I've been talking so much about the Cold War also, because the Cold War is an ideological battle fought on the global scene with the non-aligned movement joining in, is that the history of social movements or anti-social movements in the 20th century generates certain models of exploitation that then some parties prefer and others reject. And this is the history we need to look at from a Marxian perspective. Thank you very much.
I think what I'll suggest is that people speak into the mic because we are recording,
So maybe
and
you-
so that way people's questions will be heard for posterity as well. There's another mic here. Can pass it
Okay,
around.
great.
It's a
Okay.
little awkward because I didn't think to order a different type of mic, but I think we'll be able to go around the room with it. Would you like to take your own questions?
I can, because you will already be walking around. Yeah. So, please, who wants to have a go?
There we go. You might have to come a little over there. Let's see how far this will go.
Okay. Thank you for such an amazing presentation. My name is Eric Foreign. My question is, I was wondering to what degree, it seems your thesis is mainly that EPZs were used as a, the covers that being used as a development tool. I was wondering if you could talk more about whether, and almost as a tax dodge. I mean, you made the argument that it's basically irrational, that that's where the savings comes from, is from skipping out on taxes. To what degree are they also a means of labor control, and do they afford employers and EPZs easier control over labor? I was wondering if you could talk more about labor struggles in EPZs. I know there have been many. Yeah, so how does labor struggle fit into the EPZ, the spread of EPZs? Thank you.
I'm a bit jet-lagged, so I have maybe a slightly gloomy day. So I'll tell you about the backlash on labor struggles that EPZs mean. Of course, increased exploitation or super exploitation, which is a term that I think is quite useful because it means that capital doesn't pay labor sufficient wages to reproduce the labor power. So this means that there is a lot of uprisings, wildcat strikes, and so forth. Usually in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, there's a couple of very important. So in order to have an EPZ, you need to pass a law. Yeah, you need to have a parliament or a dictatorship that says, okay, we have an EPZ Act now in our national constitution, and 2-3 important things go in there. Okay, the tax dodging and everything, which I've already mentioned. What goes in there is also a guarantee against nationalization. So, for example, in countries like Mauritius, where you have like socialist governments on the rise, a lot of the local bourgeoisie businesses will actually establish holdings in the EPZ. And then they could be held accountable under international law that if a socialist government nationalizes the sugar mills, for example, which are then held by a holding in the EPZ company. Sorry, I'm coming to the labor struggles. The other thing is that you have this anti-union legislation, and you have what Helen Zaffer very importantly has called the muse of the male breadwinner, which is that these countries imagine that labor is actually male and that household incomes are generated by men. So in many parliamentary debates across the world, you will have people saying, oh yeah, but it will be mainly women workers because you have like around 70% women working in EPZs and their wages are secondary. So let's pass a law that either waives the minimum wage or establishes a lower minimum wage than in the national economy for the EPZs. And that the entry of female labor into the zones initially, in my view, And here I would, for example, and I've already published on that in my view, Ivor Ong's research is wrong, where she says that it's these neo-feed women who enter these factories. Actually, the first generation of EPZ workers is often like late 20s, early 30s. They have experiences in plantation economies or in the needlework industry that I've mentioned for Puerto Rico. Similarly, in Mexico, you have early, already kind of foreign enterprises in the late 1930s that have certain tax incentives before the border industrialization programs. These women still rise up, but they are then increasingly replaced by young women 14, 15, 16 years of age. And they do not necessarily rise up immediately. They then need to organize wildcat strikes and so forth. You have formations of riot police units. In Mauritius, you have a lot of money going into riot police training. In the 70s, would be interesting to look where the money came from. I sometimes ask myself how much of the EU money that went to Greece went into training these kind of really tough riot police guys that have this kind of important gear. Or Margaret Thatcher in 1980 started training this special police unit that had this Zulu drumming technique, you know, these round shields that later beat up the miners. So already 3 years before the miners' strike, Thatcher knew I'll crack down on these guys, so I need a really tough riot police unit. I have a gloomy day, so I'm not talking about the success. You have important struggles. On the other hand, you also have unions like the AFL-CIO going to Puerto Rico with the investors. There's I forgot the name of the guy, I would need to look it up, but he's very ill-famous for having been like a northeastern US trade unionist who went to Puerto Rico with the AFL and basically was like the guy who killed off all unionization policies in the EPZ there. And you have important struggles also, but then the thing is that the more EPZs you have, the more mobile labor is capital is, of course, because you have the infrastructure paid for by the state in most cases, and then in order to kind of ship out 1,000 sewing machines, you can do that more or less overnight. You leave the tables, you leave the materials, you don't have a big stock anyway in an EPZ factory. So, for example, the iPhone, the Foxconn strike in Shenzhen, I think it was in 2010, 3 or 4 weeks before the iPhone 4 was supposed to come on the market. I think the workers there in Shenzhen, they knew very well that the iPhone was coming on the market, and they knew that they had a really strong position in the commodity chain. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think they got something like 80% wage increases, different housing policies and so on within a week. But half a year later, most of the production was elsewhere. Also, what I heard, for example, what's very important in the global textile and garment business is middlemen. Meanwhile, you have a company called Li Fung in Hong Kong that control around 60% of the global garment orders. So you may remember this in the 19th century, this was to Shanghai someone was really famous. And in the 20th or early 21st century in Hong Kong people say to Li Fung something. So if you make a dodgy deal, then you Li Fung something. And these agents, I didn't speak to anyone from Li Fung because they don't pick up the phone. They have some kind of, you can't find, I tried to find them in Hong Kong, but it was not really possible. But I spoke to a German agent in Mauritius who takes around 20 million shirts orders per year. And he says that he keeps a small factory in Mauritius running, although it's not super profitable. But then allocates, let's say, I don't know, 19.5 million to various countries, And if things go really wrong, then he has like a workforce in Mauritius that knows how to do the shirts. Then he makes a deal with the government. He gets some exemption on importing foreign contract laborers, some kind of new indenture model. So then you bring in, I don't know, 1,000 Malagasy workers and put them on machines in a rented factory, and then you can fend off a strike in Karachi by expanding production in Mauritius. Sorry, it's a gloomy day, so that's what I have to say. Of course, there's a lot of anger, and also if you want to read something really nice, I think because you also have quite educated labor in these EPZs. So if the workers of the Gurgaon SEZ in India, they have an amazing blog where they kind of write down all the rubbish of their of what's going on there. They have beautiful pictures on there. They make jokes about factory management and about the local government and so forth. But yeah, a couple of examples.
It's the first time. Thank you, that was really wonderful, and I look really forward to the book. And there's so many different things. I wanted to ask one question about the way in which you characterize EPZs as a kind of competing regime to neoliberalism. I think you mentioned as a competing regime of exploitation. Because I'm still trying to get the periodization right that you're trying to portray. In many ways, you can say that EPZs, especially SEZs, are a way of introducing neoliberal reforms into the country. So rather than sort of competing with neoliberalism, it's a way of introducing the neoliberalism. So I was curious if you could comment a bit on that relation that you're talking about. And then I just wanted to mention, apropos the last discussion about labor, that one aspect, which I'm sure you just didn't have time to get to, but the role of quota in the textile industry as being a major force behind the EPZs because of the ability to move within the zone world as a kind of parallel world before re-entering the tariff zone, right? Which then became this kind of parallel universe for companies and introduced an entirely different level.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. First question, I blame it on the jet lag. That's exactly what I mean. I mean that EPZs are not a competing regime to neoliberalism. They are neoliberal, but they are the early neoliberal practice in the 1940s, which means that therefore we need to change the periodization, and they compete with what Giovanni Arrighi calls the Global New Deal, or what you have in regulationist approaches, where you have this idea of a pattern of regulation and a mode of accumulation, and they always tend to be in some kind of equilibrium, but you have like one dominant at a time. And I call this in the publication 2014 in Contributions to Indian Sociology, I speak of the untimely coincidence of modes of exploitation in capitalism, which means that, for example, in India, in the Nehruvian state, that's usually considered a Keynesian or whatever import substitution based state, you have the first Asian EPZ set up in 1965, and actually the planning for Kandla EPZ has been going on since 1952. So I'm fully d'accord. And the second point about the quota here, I discussed this in this chapter that's coming out in January on EPZs and global class formation. That's another actually dimension of the anti-market policies in EPZs, because it's another way of defining who has access to this top layer of high surplus generation. And a country like Mauritius, for example, would never have been so successful in EPZ policies without the quota. Another example is Bangladesh, which, funnily enough, I think 1976 the EPZ was set up in Bangladesh by a company called Dash, which was founded by a general from the military dictatorship. I forgot his name, but lots of squares and so on. And I think the National Congress Center is named after him. It's something with N. And there's kind of this global legend that this guy was walking through Paris and passed by the headquarters of a South Korean corporation that's in the textile and garment business. And then he got this idea that he could set that up in Bangladesh, and so he made a deal with the South Koreans. This is all featured very prominently in World Bank reports on the Bangladeshi EPZ, which are written by a relative of the military dictator of Bangladesh. And the competing story is that Robert McNamara, during his early tenure as World Bank president, came to Bangladesh after the killings and the floods and so on, and said, "Look, guys, you need here's the Indians, they will train you." Then Bangladesh, of course, got this amazing quota deal under the multi-fiber arrangement in 1974, and that set it off from countries like Sri Lanka, also on, who had much fewer quotas. And I think despite this ATC agreement on textiles and clothing that the WTO put in place in '95, I think, where like every 3 years 17% of the quota were supposed to be phased out. Despite this, you still see these kind of residuals of these quota regimes, and of course you continue to have multilateral and bilateral agreement like the African Growth and Opportunities Act. I remember when I was in Mauritius, like every year the negotiations of the African Growth and Opportunities Act were like one of the central pieces in the national newspapers and in the national TV, like, okay, the Prime Minister goes to Washington and tries to get us a continuation on the agua, as they call it. And then they were always kind of trying to trade in the military base in Diego Garcia, the US military base, as a counter, as a token for saying, okay, we won't complain to you, the UN, about your military base, which is on our national soil, but you've taken it away from us, but then we want preferential export quota to the US. And the amazing thing, sorry to be talking so long, but if you Google, you can get agua lists, because these are itemized. So this shirt will have a 5-digit item number. So it actually creates a massive bureaucracy to get a certain type of shirt through the US Customs under agua regulations. Factories in Mauritius, they employ an agua clerk to handle these regulations and make sure that all the components are from the right import places and so forth. So it's super complex because there's only 5 countries where you can get the cotton from, or something like that. This is another example how this is supposed to be putting away this red tape and this bureaucracy, but actually EPZs are an amazingly bureaucratic apparatus. I couldn't imagine that any non-EPZ product goes through so many bureaucratic checks and so on as these shirts and iPhones and so on. Sorry, long answer. And it's all going to be in this book, you know.
You already mentioned about how these follow the Cold War pattern with excluding the socialist countries. But were these zones set up specifically by the American empire, or were they working more openly with the other capitalist countries, or was it just like an American empire thing?
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good, really good question. I think Steve Rayner once wrote something really nice in a paper published in 2002. Sorry if I quote you here on the TV, but it's shit happens and so did capitalism. It's sorry, shall we erase it? No, and I think there's not really an intention. That's why I'm quoting this now. There's not an intention in like, okay, we have this idea. They don't sit down on the drawing board and say we need this thing and we make it an EPZ. I think these policies in Puerto Rico, they develop bits by bits. Someone comes up with this tax incentive idea, then someone else adds this development corporation to it and so forth, and it slowly develops, and suddenly the US realizes this really works very well. And then it's initially an American empire project, but already in 1952, in this Caribbean Development Commission conference, you have like, because who had Caribbean possessions at the time? The French, the British, the Dutch, and a couple of other European still colonial powers. So, for example, you could make a relatively direct link to the opening of the EPZ in Jamaica, and then the knowledge travels from there in the 1950s, late 1950s, to Mauritius, where it first emerges as a pioneering industries project. Also the same, I would say, happens in the French Empire, or in the crumbling, disintegrating French Empire, so that often when nation states, post-colonial nation states gain independence, when they are kind of born, there's already a development corporation there, there's already a development bank there, there are kind of already the nests and structures for an EPZ there. I'm not saying that any development policy that's capitalist moves towards being an EPZ, but I think it's an American invention that's quite quickly picked up. But still, I would say that until the early 1960s, until the Alliance for Progress ends, it's mostly American money going in there, mostly American consultancy. It's direct American intervention in national or colonial development policies. And then I think the US changes a bit and takes this camouflage position by channeling development policies through the World Bank, through United Nations technical assistance missions and so forth. Taiwan is quite a good example, because in the early 1960s, the guy who would then later open the first Taiwanese EPZ, he wrote to the United Nations Economic and Social Council saying, oh, we had this US money, but now we don't get it anymore, because there was the trouble with China, and so the US needed to take a kind of lower position, and then we got some World Bank or IBRD money, and now we need some UNTA money so to finish the project. That's all a bit speculative, because I'm a sole researcher in this, and I'm dealing with millions of pages of files, some scanned, some I've taken pictures of myself, and so I can't really standardize the data or kind of say like this is a representative trend globally, but I can express these gut feelings about it.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions out of this fascinating story. I mean, one of them is if you could reflect a little bit more on the role of Arthur D. Little in this whole story. Is it a constant in the mix, or is it at times when it's been really out front? And the second is a more general question, because these export processing zones are just one form of territorial development policy. And if you get, regional development, you have the European Union with its, regional development policies, you have urban development corporations, you have, in other words, these zones in which something special happens come in many shapes and sizes. And I wondered if there's something special about the legal or political way in which the export processing zones are incorporated. That means that they're, say, a species apart from urban entrepreneurialism and regional development and urban development corporations and all the other things that go on.
Yeah, thank you very much. The Arthur D. Little role is a bit complicated to carve out because the company was, I think, in 91 or 92, they went into financial difficulties and they were bought out by a German company. And then one thing that happened was that the archives were auctioned off. And the MIT only auctioned parts of the archives. Whereas what I heard from MIT archive staff, that former ADL members bought other parts of the archives, but they are not accessible. So I can only look at part of the historical record of ADL. And of course I also see a lot of the historical record in Puerto Rico and in other countries where I go. Sorry, I'm not, it's really a gloomy day. The other problem is that the USAID files in College Park are not, they have no keywords before 1965. So you only get the file number. So trying to find something in the USAID records in College Park when I was there in 2010 was like looking for a needle in the haystack. But I would say that the ADL role is constant until the mid-1960s, definitely. I would speculate that because Alliance for Progress doesn't work so well and ADL had a huge stake in that, there might have been then ways of reconsidering. And there's already on the Mexican maquiladoras in 1965, on the planning there's already conflicting historical information. So this Richard Bolin claims to have been a sole agent for Juarez and one other city on the border. He's published a lot of books with this Flagstaff Institute, and they all have wonderful titles. One on the maquiladoras is Time of Decision, also is the title. And there's an interview with him, a long 50-page interview with himself in the book that he published. And there he claims that it was all his own idea, and back then he had a company called International Parks running the show. The thing is that he has Alzheimer's since 2008, and I've only been able to meet with his son twice, who lives a bit north of New York, but who was very young back then and is also not very, he's not an EPZ guy. So yeah, sorry, it's a bit speculative. The other question is possibly also more important. I think the important thing, first of all, is that EPZs are not only this territorial regime, but they are also a temporal regime. Because often the idea is that you get a 10-year tax incentive and then you would stay. So the idea is that you get like a gift, that there's an act of reciprocating on the side of the nation state by putting up a lot of money and giving you this 10-year window to establish yourself. And there's always this idea of, although it's not framed in these terms, but I think it's always this idea of a great leap forward within these 10 years, and it never happens. I mean, okay, some companies, they stay more than 10 years, but then this is often actually local capital that's staying longer in EPZs. And I think that's important to consider when we look at what kind of regime EPZs are, that they are a spatio-temporal regime. Otherwise, I'm not really an expert on urban development corporations, so it would be difficult for me to date the emergence of urban development corporations, for example. I think these global trading blocs like the European Economic Community and so forth, they are very different territorial entities because they are they are designed to be durable and expanding, whereas the initial idea for setting up an EPZ is always that you would close it down at some point because you don't need it anymore. And I think the interesting thing is then that they are kind of a trickster being, as an anthropologist. Maybe we could say that they come in and they look like the temporary guests, but they actually become the real thing. So, for example, a country like Mauritius nowadays has an EPZ law where we could have instead of the noisy people next door, we could have an EPZ next door, and we would just need to hire a guy from Securicore, one of these big global security corporations that have a deal with the Mauritian customs, and then can kind of be at the door and make sure that the customs procedures are handled properly at the door. And although there are some big EPZs, they are still small in scale. Also, they are never 1 million workers or so, you know. There are maybe a couple of 100,000. I don't know if I've answered your question sufficiently now. If there's more, I would be happy to hear it.
This is just a speculative question. A few years back, you organized a session called Marxism Resurgence. And I suppose the question that comes to my mind is, how does your work fit into a resurgent Marxism?
Thank you. On the one hand, okay, I'll say it out loud now, then I'll need to publish it quickly. I think we need to turn for something called an anthropology of the obvious. And anthropology has for many decades been concerned with things that are not really obvious. And the obvious factors in the world is what you are working on: war, global US warring, violence, global exploitation, regimes, global structures that are actually very coherent and not complex, diffuse assemblages, although of course every EPZ has its different history and its different trajectory and its particularities, but still everyone in the EPZ actually has a feeling that they are part of a global regime. They all know that there's several thousand other EPZs out there. One of the first questions that the textile worker in a dyeing factory in Mauritius, who had just gone on an illegal strike with 180 colleagues, asked me is, I want to know how much I would earn if I was working in Germany. And I said, nothing, because there's no factory where you could be working. So my contribution to a resurgent Marxism would be to put these central questions of accumulation, exploitation and resistance to the fore of anthropology, to do this in a historical, materialist, structuralist, possibly perspective, for an anthropology that is concerned with, I would call this medium range historical anthropology of 50 to 200 years. That's hopefully my contribution to resurgent Marxism in anthropology.
Just have a quick question. Maybe building on some of the preceding questions and your answers, it seems to me, with respect to your presentation, that the initial group of people who were exploited were global north workers in New England and New Hampshire that you referred to. And the people who were not so exploited, perhaps, were people in Puerto Rico and the South. Although that's not, I think it's clear that they are exploited, but the main complaints seem to be coming from workers in the United States, the FLCAO and so forth. I'm wondering now in the contemporary era where there's clearly an industrial working class that over 80% exists in the South, whether any kind of analysis can be made of global north workers and the shift of production, however marginal it is, and it is quite marginal, that's going back to big cities in North America and Europe. What can be said about these workers? I think that's a very critical question in understanding the kinds of periodization that you're looking at. Anything?
Yeah, thanks. That's really great. I mean, of course, there was also a lot of complaints and resistance in Puerto Rico, and if you, I mean, I said there's this Shakespearean quality to this hearing document. They also invite people from Puerto Rico to talk. Foremen, garment workers, and so forth. So, and you hear that these people are not happy, but of course the issue is that it's like, if you call it like not primitive, but like initial accumulation, like the German version of this important chapter is die ursprüngliche Akkumulation, which would be the initial or original accumulation. And if you consider this expansion to Puerto Rico as an initial or original act of accumulation, then if you haven't been exploited by capital for some time, then you might feel lucky if it happens again, in a way. Because these zones are not zones that are, it's not an initial incorporation into the world market. All these zones have been part of world market, plantation economies in Malaysia and so forth. They may just have been abandoned for a couple of years or decades or subject to a different regime, like in the People's Republic of China before 1979. But of course the main losers in this story initially are northern workers. One important trend is that we have recurring suggestions in northern states. For example, Thatcher in the late 70s, early 80s had this enterprise zones program that didn't work so well. I think, isn't your Oxford book also dealing with such an enterprise? No.
Enterprise zones are going on all over the place.
Yeah. I don't think there's one enterprise zone that's very successful, but you have in The Guardian in the 70s, you have articles, and also in some British archive I found something from some guy from the UK that had been sent to Taiwan to find out how they do it, how are they so successful. And it's really funny because he must just have been on the wrong plane, you know. If he had been there with the Irish consultants or so on, then they could have told him right away how you do it. But these, and the US, I think also under Bush too, they also had this plan for an SEZ in East LA with a $4.50 minimum wage, thinking that they could So that's one way that global northern workers are affected in Detroit or elsewhere. Another thing that I should say is that I am not so sure, honestly speaking, whether this EPZ, SEZ regime that was operational or that I'm sketching here until the early 2000s or so is still that kind of reality in the present. I mean, the EU had a big, this German guy heading the European Parliament, he suggested to turn the whole of the Peloponnese into an SEZ in 2010 or 12 as a response to the Greek crisis. I was in Cyprus in 2011 or 12 and doing some interviews about the SEZ or EPZ there. And the main guy who was Shannon trained, he was on holiday unfortunately, but his assistant, she told me that they had scrapped the EPZ 1 year ago because they felt that banking was doing much better, and at that time Cyprus was already in this big banking crisis. And she said, and I so much regret it. Last week we had a Chinese delegation here and they wanted to have an EPZ and they would bring 10,000 workers right away. And we scrapped it last year, so we need to find a way to do it again. And then of course you have, I mean, Piraeus Harbor would be something interesting to look at. I think that's bought up by Chinese corporations now, and I feel that whenever you talk about Chinese overseas investment, it's SEZ investment. So for them it's like as if they've been, as if it's like an inculturation of the Chinese businessman, that it's like, yeah, what you have as like the thing you got from your infant years, and you take it for granted that there will always be an SEZ somewhere and you hook up there. But I think there would be a lot more work, more research to do about this. One other thing is of course that if you look at the price of garments and light consumer electronics items and so on, then they wouldn't be so low without the EPZs, and that means of course that the purchasing power of northern workers with their wages also is higher because of the exploitation in the south. So that's also something important to consider. It also means that maybe the value of garments in relation to the value of food has changed. So I think it might have had, that would be a long-term, I don't know, maybe some kind of Ruth Benedict style culture and personality study, but in a different way, like how do we actually value garments in relation to a loaf of bread now, and how did we value them 60 years ago? I don't know. Yeah, if you see like how people shop at H&M and they know that they wash the shirt 4 times and it won't look nice anymore, but they just do it because they know like Nike said, just do it. Or Nike said, just do it, and they just do it. They buy the thing, they wash it 4 times, throw it away, and buy another one because they can. And that's of course not very good.
Other comments? Questions? Patrick, do you want to close with any comments?
Yeah, I think I've made the replies I've given to all the questions have been a bit elaborate, but the questions were all really great, and was really good to come here to one of the core arenas of social science, avant-garde social science productions in the world, and it helped me a lot to clarify things already in the preparation, and I want to thank you all very much for having been here and spoken to me.
measures.
We're not supposed to touch it, so it'll end up being edited so that it ends here. But
So
yeah,
maybe
don't
you
tell
can cut
any
out the shit
communist
happens
secrets.
so it can-
I don't have control over it, so but I wouldn't worry about it. I don't think. I mean, if he wrote it, yeah, I don't think.
Because he's a very good friend of mine. I'll ask him later in the.
Oh, okay. I mean, if he wrote it, I can't imagine he
I
would
think
be
he's actually quite brilliant, but he looked like, whoa.
All right, well, let us know. I mean, we can always take the entire thing down. The problem is that it's puny TV, so it's not something that Yes, it's actually I'll send it to you so that you know. Yeah. Do you know the work of Johanna Bachmann? You might find her interesting. I'll send you her name as well.
See you later? Yeah. Thank you so much.
It was great, your presentation.
Thank you.
A friend, he's a historian.
From Puerto Rico.
Yes, I was telling you a few minutes ago that the model of Puerto Rico, we have 4 phases, no? The first phase was manufacturing in the 40s and 50s. You know, make chairs.